Welcome back, traveller. Tonight we're stepping into the velvet-lit parlours of the 19th century, where a dainty chemist's bottle sat beside the family Bible and turned real women into polite apparitions. You've heard the myth, sinful dens and scandal, but the truth hid at home, laudanum culture, patent medicines, and a smiling, soothing syrup sold as virtue in a glass. We'll crack the seal on the marketing, the marriages, and the midnight arithmetic that made domestic addiction look like good housekeeping. And we'll follow the receipts to see how the same bargain echoes now. If that sounds like a story you weren't supposed to hear, you're in the right room. Before we pour, do 2 quick kindnesses. Tap like, hit subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I want to see our map of night owls and early birds light up while we open the drawer. Everyone pretended not to notice. Open the parlor door and breathe it in. Coal fire, beeswax, orange peel, and something darker medicinal, like a bitter flower that forgot its manners. You'd see it on the mantel or nightstand, the small amber shape that caught gaslight like trapped tea. That chemist's bottle didn't shout. It whispered solutions the way rain whispers to thirsty roofs. In a century allergic to fuss, people loved tools that look polite. So a parlor remedies kit sat beside calling cards and crochet. And in that respectable company, a quiet guest took its seat. The tincture that would define laudanum culture more than any scandal sheet ever could. You have to picture the sales pitch. Not a back alley wink, but a widow quiet clerk. Gloves neat, measuring drops with a gravity that made you trust the math. Mothers came with sleepless infants. Clerks with splitting heads. Clerics whose sermons outlasted their nerves. Labels promised steadiness for stomachs, courage for coughs, mercy for menstrual pain. This wasn't vice. It was logistics. A Victorian opium habit rarely began in a den. It began with a receipt, a polite nod, and a cork that said, "Later." You walked home feeling like you'd bought rain insurance. Pain was the century's common language. Industry roared. Childbirth negotiated, railways shook bones they hadn't met before, and winter damp settled in joints like squatters. Doctors did what they could, but office hours were thin and pockets thinner. Enter the booming bazaar of patent medicines, each bottle a sermon on relief you could hold in your hand. Some were harmless syrups. Some hid lead in their sweetness. Some were honest if strong. The wonder, and the trap, was that several worked just well enough to make the second purchase feel wise. You'd fold the bottle into the household rhythm, the way you fold a shawl. Gently, with a logic that made sense at midnight. Teaspoon after a funeral, because tears ache in the ribs. A little to smooth the edges of a long, echoing Sunday. This was domestic addiction in its prelude, and you wouldn't spot it yet because nothing looked wild. Dependence arrived in slippers, not boots. That's the sleight of hand of genteel dependence. The habit wears lace at first. Listen for the leitmotif that keeps whispering through these rooms, only until I'm myself again. That's how the slide begins. Laudanum could make a widow eat, a child sleep, a printer's hand stop trembling long enough to letter the gospel. Relief teaches loyalty. Loyalty edits memory. The cork goes in with a promise, comes out with an excuse, and somewhere between the two, you start measuring days by the clink of glass. You don't mean to write your calendar in drops, but the bottle is such a punctual friend. The pharmacy itself staged the confidence game without meaning to. Blue jars, Latin names, polished scales, science dressed in respectable clothes. You'd feel safer there than at home with an old folk infusion. And honestly, sometimes you were safer. Standardized strength, proper storage, a clerk trained to raise an eyebrow if you returned too soon. Yet the same counter served regulars whose hidden Victorian ailments didn't fit in sermons or dinner chatter. Melancholy, panic at bridges, memories that wouldn't turn their faces to the wall. Class manners added a varnish no law could peel. Gentlewomen weren't supposed to clutch at public pleasures, but private courage, decanted at the right hour, didn't bruise reputation. So the chemist's bottle learned to travel quietly in reticules and sewing baskets. a prop in a morality play that pretended to be about fortitude while understudying ease. You can almost hear the house murmur, "We don't indulge." That's the sentence that built the soft staircase to genteel dependence. Meanwhile, advertisements sang like canaries in gilt cages. They promised nervine balms and soothing cordials painted in fonts that made you feel smarter just for reading them. A sick room didn't look desperate. It looked curated. You kept a tray, spoon, napkin, water glass. A dignified guest of honor. Relief became ritual, and rituals are sticky. Once your hands learn a choreography that calms a problem, they'll replay it even on nights when sleep would have won without help. That's how laudanum culture burrowed into muscle memory. Of course there were warnings. A neighbor's cousin reduced to a shadow. A poet who wrote heaven with one hand and pawned his cufflinks with the other. A child whose soothing syrup smoothed too much. But warnings compete poorly with midnight. You tell yourself you're not that story. Your bottle wears a better label. Your chemistry is modest and moral. The trick with habits that hide in plain sight is simple. They borrow your best words. Prudence, decorum, stewardship. Notice how the household conspired without malice. The maid washed the spoon. The husband admired the improved cheer. The vicar praised your return to choir. Relief creates evidence, and evidence persuades the heart to keep its favorite witness on retainer. Over time, tolerance negotiates in whisper tones. You need a touch more to land in the same soft chair. The cork's little sigh becomes the room's metronome. That's the pulse of domestic addiction, polite enough to pass for health, until a week arrives that requires you to stop. And stopping, as you'll see, is where the mask rips. The headache roars back with compound interest. Sleep becomes a door with too many keys. The world feels overlit and undergentle. You promise yourself a tapering that rarely keeps its promises because pain is a lousy negotiator and memory is a generous liar. Many Victorians met this cliff alone, blaming nerves while the bottle smirked from the drawer. Others found chemists who practiced quiet triage. Less today, a substitute tomorrow. Let's pause at the mantel and look again at that neat amber glow. It's not a villain. It's a mirror. It reflects a century in love with self-improvement, terrified of scandal, and busy beyond rest. You would have done the same, and so would I. That's why we study the choreography, not to sneer at it, but to learn the steps we still dance today, with different labels. And now that you can hear the bottle's soft leitmotif, we can follow it into the loud marketplace that fed it. The jingles, testimonials, and mail-order miracles that multiplied the craving. Ready to walk into the print shop, where patent medicines bought type by the ton and turned relief into a business plan. Step into the print shop and you'll taste metal on your tongue. This is where pain got packaging. Columns blossom with miraculous cordials, each one promising sleep, appetite, nerve, and the restoration of womanly bloom by Tuesday. Behind the flourish sits a simple bargain. You bring your ache, we sell you a narrative. That narrative, bound in serif pride, domesticated the Victorian opium habit until it looked like good housekeeping. And in that parade of fonts, laudanum culture stopped being a whisper and became a business plan. Copywriters learned to court the parlor. They laced their promises with etiquette, full of the most delicate constitutions, suitable for infants, approved by travelers of distinction. It wasn't a drug, it was a companion with manners. Testimonials stacked like hymn verses. My sleeplessness departed. My nerves regained their former tone, because stories persuade where warnings yawn. You weren't chasing vice. You were choosing the right parlor remedies for a house that prized calm. That's how genteel dependence learns to curtsy before it sits down. Packaging did half the persuading. Amber glass caught gaslight like tame fire. Scripted labels turned dosage into poetry. Corks whispered hush when you needed a friend who didn't talk back. The chemist's bottle became an altarpiece. Dignified, obedient, almost moral. If sin were this tidy, who could object? Meanwhile, printers invoiced by the inch and editors pretend it's medical news. You can almost hear the century exhale. The solution is beautiful, therefore it must be safe. Brand names march like regiments. One claimed Egyptian calm, another Asiatic repose, and a third swore its recipe descended from a monk who never existed. Patent medicines weren't always patented. The word meant proprietary, not government-blessed. But the posture felt official enough to quiet questions. Relief turned into a logo. And behind the flourish, morphine or tincture of opium did the heavy lifting while the label did the social laundering. The ads also solved a problem nobody named. Privacy. You could order by post, wrapped in brown paper, with only the postman as witness, for hidden Victorian ailments, postpartum tears, panic that struck on bridges, grief that stole appetite, a dotted line for your address. 3 shillings enclosed, and a cure would arrive that did not require confession. Domestic addiction loves a silent staircase, and mail order built one wide enough for half a nation. Moral camouflage came free with every bottle. Copy paired virtue words with chemistry, modesty, rest, serenity. Mothers bought infant soothers that were anything but infant. Clerks bought nervine restoratives, and widowers bought night tonics with labels that spared them embarrassment at the counter. If a tonic kept bread on the table by letting a seamstress work through pain, who dared scold? When a product protects dignity, it can rent your ethics at a discount. The marketplace policed itself badly and beautifully at once. Quacks failed loudly and moved on. The more skilled learned to deliver just enough genuine relief to earn a second purchase. Some chemists, conscientious sorts, quietly watered recipes or warned regulars, becoming unlikely gatekeepers between need and ruin. But profit has a louder voice than caution. Every column inch sold taught the public a reflex. Problems belonged to bottles first, conversations later. Illustrations made the fantasy tactile. Woodcuts showed angels hovering over sick beds, rosy infants, sleeping like advertisements for silence. You didn't buy opium. You bought a vignette in which your household behaved. The picture fixed what the century feared most. Scenes. No screams, no shame, no scandal. Only order like snow that falls exactly where you wanted it. There were, of course, critics. Satirists steward snake oil dukes. Journals ran exposes, a physician or two thundered about overdoses, and infants soothed into forever naps. But outrage competes poorly with a 2 a.m. bottle that actually stills a cough. The paradox is cruel. Successful relief becomes its own advertisement. Every quiet night purchased at interest pays for tomorrow's aid, based on thousands of happy experiences. Numbers bred inevitability. As railways spread, so did ads and distribution. A remedy that had once haunted one city could colonize 3 counties by harvest. Supply triggered vocabulary. Habit, dependence, tolerance, ugly words that still wore lace when spoken softly in drawing rooms. Laudanum culture achieved what all marketing dreams of. It stopped feeling like a choice and started feeling like furniture. Here's the twist few notice. The print shop didn't just sell bottles. It sold scripts for conversation. Spouses learned to ask, "Have you taken your dose?" instead of, "How shall we carry this together?" Clergy learned to bless rest rather than rebuild community around a sufferer. Employers learned to prefer a dosed worker to an honest sick day. Patent medicines didn't merely numb bodies. They edited relationships. Keep your ear on our leitmotif. Only until I am myself again. Advertising harmonized with that line until it sounded like duty. Now that we've seen how brass type made dependence respectable, we'll step into the nursery and the night shift. Infants, factory lungs, menstrual pain, toothaches, where the small daily torments of an empire fed the bottle hour by hour. Ready to follow the dropper into the rooms where pain was loudest and choices felt smallest? Step into the nursery at 2 a.m. and the world is 5 sounds. A fretful whimper, the slow tick of the mantel clock, coal settling in the grate, the rustle of muslin, and the faint clink of a chemist's bottle against a spoon. Teething is a tyrant. Colic is a critic. Sleep is a rumor. Mothers were graded by quiet, not by mercy. so a few careful drops of soothing cordial felt like competence poured from amber glass. In that hush, laudanum culture entered the cradle as a promise. Only until I'm myself again. The baby slept. The household passed its exam. The bottle earned a permanent seat on the tray. By daylight, the same logic patrolled the schoolroom. Toothache in children met camphor rubs, clove packets, and a measured dose that turned arithmetic possible. No one called it a Victorian opium habit. They called it getting through Tuesday. Meanwhile, governesses kept their own tiny flasks for nerves, a phrase that disguised a landscape. Homesickness, impossible standards and staircases that never ended. The line between parlor remedies and policy blurred. You weren't chasing bliss, you were preventing scenes. Follow the road to the mill and taste the dust. Textile rooms coughed lint like weather. Looms beat time against lungs. The shift bell was a drum you could not ignore. Men and women, hands raw, ears ringing. Another at midday to hush the ache. A last at close to outwalk the ghosts of motion. No one bragged. Relief was a tool, like a shuttle or a wrench. That's how domestic addiction begins in work clothes, with practicality, not romance. Evening found miners by the hearth, black crescents under their nails, a rattle tucked in the chest that soup alone couldn't argue with. Laudanum, folded into ale or sipped neat, made coughs behave long enough to hear your child's story. It felt like stewardship. Keep bread coming, keep sleep within reach. Patent medicines promised lungs comforted in a font that sounded like a prayer. And when a man woke able to lift without swearing, he believed the label had told no lie. Women navigated a different calendar of pain. Menstruation, postpartum aches, prolapse that no one would name above a whisper. These were the hidden Victorian ailments that the parlor mastered with grace and drops. A mother who could rise, straighten the nursery, and sing at evensong was praised as, behind the hymn, the cork clicked. Genteel dependents wore a respectable dress, punctual, discreet, and always just for today. It's hard to argue with a tonic that lets kindness keep its appointments. Dentistry auditioned courage daily. Before routine anesthesia, the chair was a battlefield, and the prize was silence. A dash before, a draft after, and the jaw remembered enough mercy to allow soup. Barbers, surgeons, and backroom tooth pullers all developed their own drops and talk rituals. Distract, dose, deliver. The patient shook the practitioner's hand, went home relieved, and wrote the success into the neighborhood's folklore. That's how laudanum culture stitched itself into civic memory, one unscreamed extraction at a time. Sleeplessness loved respectable houses. Think of clerks whose ledgers glowed in gaslight until numbers crawled, of widows who counted bells instead of sheep, of writers whose heads brewed ink when the room begged for dark. A thimble of relief turned the pillow from tribunal to refuge. Only until I'm myself again, the leitmotif returned, tidy as folded linen. Yet by week's end, the self who needed retrieving seemed always to be waiting in the next bottle, not the next morning. Employers preferred a dosed worker to an absent one, and the economy quietly approved. Pocket flasks rode trams. Small vials lived in sewing kits. A clerk's inkwell had a friend he didn't log. The Night Nation outsourced triage to personal chemistry, and patent medicines cashed the receipt. You can almost hear the century's mantra. It kept shops open and kitchens calm, and it kept the Victorian opium habit invisible until it wasn't. Tolerance edited the ledger without asking permission. A dose that once quieted became a suggestion. Pain developed opinions. The dropper learned longer paths. Households compensated with substitutions, this syrup on Tuesdays, that cordial on Sundays, telling themselves variety equaled safety. A handful of chemists, uneasy, watered recipes, or warned regulars. Others sold what the hand reached for. Math, not morality, drove the slide. More to get the same, and the same arriving later each week. Class didn't change the alkaloid, only the label. In drawing rooms, genteel dependents came in cut glass with Latin on the wrapper. In workers' cottages, the solution traveled in reused vials with slang names and fewer scruples. Upstairs called it a nervine. Downstairs called it rest. Both meant opium in a cloak fitted to the room. The chemistry was democratic. The shame was not. That's the social genius and cruelty of the chemist's bottle. Speaks every dialect. Clergy, teachers, and lettered men went saints of abstinence either. Sermons required stamina. Classrooms required patience. Manuscripts required nights that pretended not to be nights. A tonic before the pulpit. A draft after term. A writer's drop for the throat that also quieted everything else. When words are your trade, the hush is a wage. And so laudanum culture won quiet victories under collars and gowns, applauded by results, pardoned by exhaustion. Hold the cross-section in your hands. Nursery hush, factory cough, private grief. The throb in a jaw. The ledger that must balance. These were not villains looking for a vice. These were citizens negotiating pain with the tools on the mantel. Now imagine what happens when doctors, editors, and lawmakers finally lean over the counter and say, "What exactly is in that?" Labels shift, warnings arrive, and the market learns new manners. Ready to step into the consultation room, where regulation, scandal, and medical fashion tried, awkwardly, to push the bottle back a few inches. Picture a doctor's surgery with a coal fire that never quite stops sulking, glass front cabinets blinking with instruments, and a desk where invoices nap under a stethoscope. This is where the century starts asking impolite questions. What precisely sits inside that polite chemist's bottle? How many grains make relief, and how many make a widow? Medicine is professionalizing. Exams, journals, societies, and with that new posture comes an itch to measure. The same world that industrialized locomotives now tries to industrialize mercy, and laudanum culture feels the room getting brighter. Physicians begin to publish case notes with a new frankness. Infants oversoothed, clerks much reduced, ladies habitual to the night draft. No gore, no gossip, just numbers that make the polite fiction sweat. You can sense the pivot. Where parlor remedies once lived beyond criticism, they now share a bench with data. The good doctor still prescribes tincture. He isn't naive. But he adds instructions that sound like guardrails. Smaller spoons, longer intervals. Sleep earned by sunlight and fresh air first. It's not prohibition. It's triage that finally says its own name. Meanwhile, newspapers discover the thrill of the exposé. A coroner's inquest becomes headline theatre. A bottle on a mantelpiece, a tragic baby, a jury that wishes the label had shouted louder. Editors learn the profitable cadence, shock, reform, repeat, and the public learns a new reflex. Flip the bottle and read. It's here that patent medicines lose a little lacquer. The best firms adapt. The worst simply move their ads to cheaper papers, and readers develop a nose for overpromises as keen as any apothecary's. Regulation arrives wearing spectacles and compromise. Early pharmacy acts sort sellers from professionals, require logbooks, and treat opium not as scandal, but as inventory. It's fussy, yes, but fussy saves lives. The clerk who once nodded you through now asks a brisk question or two, and the ledger learns your surname. Genteel dependence hates this. Privacy was half the appeal. But families who've buried a child or watched a relative fade into the wallpaper find the new questions strangely comforting. Paperwork, at last, is love in a bureaucratic suit. Doctors themselves aren't monolithic saints. Some cling to the dropper. Others flirt with the newest continental fashions. Bromides here, chloral there. Hypnotism, if the room is right and the patient's wallet can stand the experiment. Medical fashion becomes a carousel, and every horse promises sleep. You and I, with our modern hindsight, are tempted to smirk. Don't. Much of this is an honest ramble to solve hidden Victorian ailments with fewer funerals. The laboratory is learning, and while it learns, the human need for rest doesn't clock out. Journals debate language because language shapes conscience. Is it habit, enslavement, nervine reliance, or the gentler custom? The softer the word, the smoother the slide. Reformers argue for plainer speech, and suddenly polite drawing rooms hear sentences with bones. Opium, poisoning. Words act like lanterns. Once a family adopts them, the dark corners of domestic addiction look less like destiny and more like a solvable mess. Precision becomes a pastoral tool. Police courts begin to see the bottle at the edge of other troubles: neglect, theft, the pawn shop cycle. Magistrates aren't chemists. They are weather vanes for harm. Some scold, others divert. A few experiment with charitable clinics that swap drops for broth and a place to sleep, while nerves learn to walk again. It's messy, inconsistent, human. But the presence of options beyond prison signals a quiet truth. A Victorian opium habit is rarely about wickedness. It's a maladapted answer to pain. Chemists adapt their choreography. They dilute certain formulas, lock others, and learn a new performance art. The raised eyebrow that says, "You've been back too soon." A decent shot becomes a small republic of care. Advice delivered with discretion. Ledgers watched for patterns. Substitutions offered that lean on bitter herbs and thyme. You can almost hear the ledger hum with purpose. Harmless, chastened, experiments with conscience without surrendering profit entirely. Even advertising learns new manners. The bolder claims retreat. Testimonials emphasize moderation. Infant soothers shed their lullaby fonts for sterner type. Some brands pivot to tonics, with less opiate and more bitters, hoping the palate won't notice and the habit will lose its foothold. It isn't pure virtue. Fear of liability is a marvelous teacher, but households benefit. The old promise, "only until I'm myself again," gets a companion clause, and only if the label agrees. Religious voices add their chord, often more practical than we expect. Sermons begin to fold in advice about sleep, sunlight, and Sabbath as genuine rest rather than marathon piety. Parish mothers' meetings share non-chemical strategies: warm baths, oat gruel, lavender on pillows, neighbors sitting up with colicky infants, so one woman's nerves don't bear the entire winter. Parlor remedies aren't banished. They're demoted from king to clerk. Still, the bottle does not vanish. Pain doesn't resign, and life insists on midnight. What changes is the presumption. Where once the dropper was the first answer, it becomes the second or third, and the family learns to keep score. How many nights this month did we sleep without help? How many spoons belong to sunlight instead of syrup? Those questions feel small, but they mark a cultural pivot. Laudanum culture loses its invisibility cloak and must now knock before it enters. Hold that image of a label with real teeth and a counter clerk with a conscience. We've watched regulation trim the wings of a fashionable rescue without ripping the bottle from history's hand. Next, the lens widens beyond the parlor. Cargoes and opium dens, real and imagined, where empire, trade, and newspapers braided fear with fascination. Ready to walk the foggy streets where sensationalism painted sin in silk, while the quieter crisis still lived at the hearth. Walk the dockside first. Tar in the air, hemp rope rasping like a smoker's laugh. Crates stamped with strange script sweating resin in the fog. Sailors swear the river has a pulse. Customs men pretend not to hear it. Somewhere between tea chests and silk bales, another cargo moves with better camouflage. Cake, ball, tincture, each form an accent of the same old plant. Empire's appetite makes tidy work of distance. You, reading the evening paper by gaslight, don't smell Calcutta in your cup, but it's there, humming beneath the lemon slice and the sermon about progress. Now turn your boots toward the East End alleys the penny press loves to haunt. Lanterns sputter. Rain varnishes brick. A cat slips past a door whose paint remembers being red. Journalists arrive with adjectives already loaded, ready to sketch an opium den like a theatre set. Bamboo mat. Lacquered pipe, bodies draped in attitudes of abandon. Sometimes they found it. Often they arranged it. Sensationalism sells, and it's easier to point at a smoky room than at a sideboard where a chemist's bottle naps beside a Bible and a bowl of oranges. Here's the uncomfortable symmetry. What the papers called vice in Limehouse they called medicine in Mayfair. The same alkaloid, two costumes. The den made for lurid woodcuts, the drawing room made for whispers among friends. If you're hunting the Victorian opium habit, you won't find its fattest roots in exotic clutter. You'll find them in decanters with respectable labels, in parlour remedies trays that could have been staged by a moral decorator. Laudanum culture was primarily domestic. The den was a scandalous mirror the nation preferred to gaze into rather than its own mantle. Still, some dens existed, as real as rent. Seafarers, off, watch, lonely migrants, men who wanted silence and found it where English wasn't the first language. The ritual, lamp, coil, gentle breath, offered a choreography different from the dropper. Pipes demanded time. Time slowed shame. You might not approve, but you can understand. In a city that graded you by speed, a room that valued slowness felt like mercy. The tragedy wasn't Oriental lacquer. It was the same old equation. Pain looking for the cheapest door. Empire turned the moral kaleidoscope again. British merchants pushed opium in Asia, while British editors scolded Oriental vice at home. If hypocrisy had a scent, London would have smelled of camphor and ledger ink. Missionaries published tracts with skulls in the margins. Parliament debated righteousness, while counting customs receipt. Meanwhile, widows in Brixton and dockers in Poplar were solving hidden Victorian ailments with identical chemistry under different names. Race and class did their cruel sorting. A pale dropper in a silver spoon earned concern. A brown pipe in a dark room earned a raid. Respectability disguised dosage and intent. Until dependents could keep a cook, pay the coalman, and sing in tune on Sunday. When vice is defined by who sees you, rather than what you swallow, policy becomes theatre. The alley is policed, the parlour is pitied, the key keeps unloading. Police raids made excellent copy. Officers crept through damp courtyards, reporters in tow, and emerged with seized lamps and moral certainty. The next morning's headline glowed, "London cleansed." But cleansing is not the same as curing. The men and women who'd spent their wages on smoke were poorer, not wiser. The bottle on the sideboard kept its job. The patent medicines kept their columns. Reform that loves spectacle rarely fixes a habit that loves privacy. Doctors who bothered to walk both worlds noticed the sameness. Blue lips, pinprick pupils, skin that forgot how to remember whether the dose came from a pipe in a curtained room or a tincture in mother of pearl. A few wrote angrily about the double standard. More wrote carefully about tapering, diet, and alternative sedatives that wouldn't burn the wick from both ends. Clinics experimented with bitter tonics, warm baths, and time. Always time, as if patience were a prescription one could bottle and sell. Meanwhile, the shipping registers kept their own diary. Years when the China trade tightened, the den stories grew shriller. Years of surplus saw a softening of tone. Economics supplied the stage directions for morality. You can scold the alley until the type wears smooth, but if the warehouse ledger smiles, nothing much changes. The populace, stuck between sermon and sale, did what people always do. They followed the cheapest relief that spoke their language and fit their calendar. Listen for our leitmotif drifting through the fog again. Only until I'm myself again. In the den, this meant one more pipe to soften the floor of the night. In the parlour, one more teaspoon to get through supper without weeping into the roast. That sentence is empire-proof. It speaks fluent river and fluent drawing room, and it tells you why the habit outlived every exposé. It solved something fast even when it broke something slow. So what worked when anything worked at all? Not panic raids, not purple prose, but small, relentless alternatives. Neighbours who sat up with colicky infants, so mothers could nap without the dropper. Employers who accepted a day off over a week, dosed into compliance. Chemists who watered, warned, and substituted with a stubborn kindness. Where those networks grew, domestic addiction lost oxygen. Where they didn't, the bottle or the pipe kept singing lullabies no hymn could drown. Hold that map in your palm. Dock, alley, parlour, paper. Same chemistry, 4 dialects. To really see the century, you have to read all 4 at once. And once you've seen it, the next question writes itself when someone finally tried to stop. Truly stop, how did they survive the days that came roaring back? In the next chapter, we'll step into cure cottages and seaside sanatoria, into tapering diaries and trembling hands, to watch a human nervous system renegotiate mornings without the amber friend. Ready to meet the clinics where the word again. Picture a clapboard house at the edge of a grey-green sea, gulls needling the wind, and a kettle ticking like a nervous wrist. Inside, curtains breathe lavender and salt. Outside, a nurse counts steps along a path the colour of chalk. This is a cure cottage, half clinic, half kindly aunt. No sermons, just a daily pageant of walks, warm baths, broths, and supervised sleep. In the ledger, it's rest. In the body, it's rebellion. You arrive with a polite smile and a suitcase of jitters you can't pack away. The program sounds boring, which is why it saves lives. Wake with the tide. Lemon water pretending to be courage. Oat porridge with enough butter to negotiate peace. A slow mile before the sun gathers its skirts. Then a nap you don't have to deserve. Boredom is treatment here. Fewer spikes, more rhythms. For a Victorian opium habit trained to expect instant quiet. Time is the new alkaloid. Doctors, often kinder than their portraits, prescribe substitution with a straight face. Bitter tonics that taste like honesty, bromide nights, valerian mutters, even the new hydropathic mania. Raps, douches, plunges, because temperature can be a teacher when language fails. You're not being cured by a single trick. You're being rehearsed back into daylight. Laudanum culture promised a switch. Recovery is a dimmer. The aim isn't heroics. It's breakfast without bargaining. Withdrawal, when it comes, is a weather system. Your skin feels overeducated. Shadows invent corners. Sleep learns 6 new wrong ways to happen. Nurses who've seen this storm 100 times speak softly and count victories in teaspoons. A laugh that surprises its owner. They've learned that domestic addiction hates witnesses, so they witness everything, particularly your strength when you're convinced you've misplaced it. Seaside sanatoria add theatre to therapy. Deck chairs line up like confessions. Blankets become capes. The sea performs a lesson in patience every minute it touches the shingle. Here, regimen is a sacrament. Sunlight rationed like medicine. Letters allowed after the walk. Visitors approved if they can talk about anything but the chemist bottle. You're not punished. You're paced. Empire built railways for freight. These places build railways for habits, replacing runaway trains with timetables. The journals call it tapering and fight about the math. Reduced by drops or by days. One doctor swears by quartering, another by courage. Beneath the formulas is a single kindness. No one is asked to leap across a ravine in the dark. You're given a bridge of planks, unimpressive, creaky, reliable. In a world that sold solutions in labels, patent medicines with trumpet fonts, this quiet arithmetic feels almost insulting. And yet, the body trusts arithmetic more than applause. Food becomes a syllabus. Broths that apologize for being thin at first, then more confident stews. Soft bread. Fish that tastes like the sea finally decided to help. Sugar's a trickster, so it's introduced like a guest with a reputation. Tea replaces tincture, cup by cup, until the hand reaches for steam out of habit. For many, appetite was the first casualty of the bottle. Its return is the first miracle that doesn't come corked. You begin to look less like paper. Work returns by inches. A letter dictated, not written. A mended hem. A potted geranium watered at the same hour for 3 days in a row. The clinic treats competence like a muscle. It gives you one light weight and counts kindly while you lift. Genteel dependence often grew in rooms where help did too much. Carry the tray, fold the shawl, turn the page. The point is not the chore. The point is the self who can do it. Confession here doesn't smell like incense. It smells like camphor and fresh sheets. Patients read their own tapering diaries to one another. Slept 2 hours. Cried once. Wanted thrice. Saying it aloud converts fog to bricks. Staff add footnotes. Lavender on the pillow. Hot water bottle for the shivers. A brisk walk when the room starts inventing arguments. Hidden Victorian ailments. Grief. Panic. Childbirth memories nobody named. Are allowed to keep their dignity while losing their veto power. Relapse is treated as weather, not wickedness. Storm, shelter, mot resume. The nurse who resets your count to 0 isn't punishing you. She's honoring math. Shame burns fuel you need for walking. So the clinic refuses to spend it. What you learn slowly is that only until I'm myself again, the old leitmotif of laudanum culture wasn't a lie. Myself again turns out to be the person who can keep promises to the morning. Some leave the cottage for fresh starts in small towns, or new rooms where the mantle doesn't remember. Others go home and reorganize the stage. Parlor remedies demoted to a locked cabinet, friends sworn to ask better questions, a chemist warned to raise that eyebrow forever. Employers are sometimes coached. Accept a true sick day over a week dozed into civility. Recovery doesn't end at the seawall. It commutes, with chores and rent, and a priest who agrees to preach nap-taking like a minor virtue. Not everyone can reach a sea breeze. For them, charities and churches experimented with urban rest, temperance hotels, day rooms with soup and sunlight, reading circles where the only intoxication was Dickens. None of it was perfect. All of it was better than secrecy. Where neighborhoods learned to prize predictability over drama, the bottle lost half its magic. And that sets up our next turn. When the parlor reorganized, how did the market pivot? What new brands, new nervings, new respectable labels rushed to occupy the empty space? And how did families tell rain from varnish when relief rebranded itself overnight? Open the cupboard a year after you swore off the amber friend and notice what's crept back in. Embossed glass mint green labels, promises that hum rather than shout. Narkit learned your new manners. Out went the glaring tincture. In came nervines, restoratives, and night powders with fonts that look like a handshake. You're still reading the old story. But now the chorus claims it's non-narcotic. That's how laudanum culture survives a scandal. It swaps costumes, keeps the melody, and lets the chemist's bottle look like it graduated. Inside the bottle, the cast list shuffles. A little bromide to sand rough thoughts, a whisper of chloral for short nights. Valerian to sound botanical, quinine to promise vigor, caffeine to tidy the morning after the night before. It's a pharmacological seesaw, down, then up, then down again. Each dose introduced as a smarter cousin of the one you quit. The new labels call it progress. Your nerves call it negotiation. A Victorian opium habit can retire its opium and keep the habit. Apothecaries discover fizz. Effervescent phosphates kiss the tongue. Pick-me-ups meet lie-me-downs in neat alternating appointments. The counter becomes a bar for parlor remedies. Measured, civilized, oddly cheerful. You're not dosing. You're taking the waters. Only the spring now burbles through a marble soda fountain next to a scale and a row of blue jars. Relief acquires bubbles and loses shame. Is public again, so it must be safe, yes? Colonial romance reappears with new postcards. Cocoa and cola promise daylight stamina. Restorative wines wink at nightfall with a sweetness that carries more chemistry than grapes. Some blends court the fashionable leaf from South America. Others swear fealty to pure malt with a side of mystery. Advertisers pitch a civilized pendulum. Stimulant for vigor, sedative for sleep, and back again tomorrow. If you're keeping score, patent medicines just franchised your day. Packaging learns science as theatre. Dainty measuring spoons, graduated droppers, disclaimers in Latin. a performance of precision that flatters the buyer's intelligence. The chemist's bottle grows a conscience in small print. Use is directed, and a halo in large, for delicate constitutions. You feel managed rather than tempted, which is exactly the point. Genteel dependence thrives when it can call itself compliance. Meanwhile, the botanicals open their own shop window. Hops pillows, passion flower tinctures, lemon balm teas, remedies old as gossip, rebranded as modern herbals. They smell honest, and often they are. They also keep the ritual intact. Brew, sip, wait, repeat. Ritual is half the medicine and half the magnet. For hidden Victorian ailments, the parish want name. A plant with a Latin tag offers privacy that looks like piety. Schedules mutata. Where the old habit lived at midnight, the new one colonizes noon. Bitter appetite tonics. Before lunch, soothing draughts after quiet practice, a composing powder when the house finally sleeps. You're no longer leaning on one wall. You're propping the day with 3 sticks. Feels more prudent because the doses are smaller, and that's how domestic addiction learns to subdivide itself until no single spoon looks guilty. Gatekeepers adapt too. Better chemists keep ledgers like weather maps, suggests Valerian, where once they'd fetch the cork and float the new moral technology of the era. Have you tried a walk, a broth, a nap? They aren't saints. They're citizens who watch funerals they didn't like. A raised eyebrow has become a public health instrument. The shop's choreography, questions first, bottles second, pushes laudanum culture one chair farther from the hearth. The women's press starts editing habits with recipes. Advice columns swap horror stories for housekeeping tactics. Porridge before bed. Mother sleeps on Tuesdays. Temperance leagues adopt tone over thunder. Fewer skulls, more logistics. They don't call it the Victorian opium habit. They call it over-reliance and offer checklists that feel like kindness. For once, shame isn't the sales agent. Class lines redraw the map, but not the chemistry. Working families meet cheaper, stronger tonics with free samples tucked into newspapers. Drawing rooms meet subscription boxes with embossed crests. Both households hear the same promise in 2 dialects, self-control from a court. Patent medicines learned what empire already knew. Translate, don't change, and profits remain fluent across neighborhoods. Law keeps nudging the stage. Schedules tighten, labels add teeth, and some ingredients move behind the counter with a paper trail attached. Manufacturers swear reform in higher, nicer fonts. The loopholes, however, breed like kittens. Food instead of drug, restorative instead of sedative. The public learns to squint. Families add a new household task, distinguishing rain from varnish. Through it all, the leitmotif persists, only until I'm myself again, now set to a waltz of new names. Some households break the spell with structure. Sunlight before syrup, soup before powders, a priest who preaches naps, an employer who prefers a frank day off to a beautifully doped week. Others slip back, not with a crash, but with a courteous nod to the latest respectable label. Which is why the real stories that matter next aren't the ads. They are the diaries, casebooks, and letters where people counted drops, wrote down nights, and told the truth in margins no printer could sell. Ready to hear those voices up close? Open a calfskin journal, and you can hear the room it's written in. The fire's low mutter, a carriage clatter fading, the scratch of a steel nib that pauses where the hand trembles. First entry, slept badly. The next week, slept. Thanks be, but needed more. And then the small, terrible honesty of arithmetic. Half dram again. This is how a Victorian opium habit looks when nobody is performing. Not sin, not scandal, but math done in candlelight by someone trying to stay married to morning. Doctors' casebooks read like weather logs for nerves. Mrs. A, complexion pale, appetite scant, accustomed to laudanum at night, advised gradual diminution, walking prescribed. No purple drama, just patient sentences that learn to say the words earlier euphemism dodged. You glimpse a century waking to its own laudanum culture, admitting in ink what parlors hid under velvet trays. These notes are not cruel. They are lanterns turned toward stairs people kept falling down. Notes to sisters carry the courage diaries can't carry alone. Tell no one. The bottle helps, but it also asks. A paragraph about the baby's rash, a recipe for jam, and then, between recipes, the confession that parlor remedies had become rehearsal, not rescue. You feel the tremor through the paper, love trying to protect privacy and life at the same time. Secrets borrow stationery. Truth borrows kin. Chemists' daybooks keep a different rhythm. Dates, surnames, quantities, sometimes an underlined pause where a clerk decided to nudge. Mrs. H, third time this fortnight, remonstrated gently. In those ledgers, commerce grew a conscience. A chemist bottle never speaks. The clerk speaks for it, adding human margin notes around a substance that doesn't care who holds it. Retail became pastoral because someone had to. Inquest reports are the documents nobody wanted to write and everybody should read. An infant found still, soothing syrup present. Jurors weighed teaspoons against lullabies and wished labels shouted louder. The point was not to invent monsters. It was to rescue language from politeness. Patent medicines did not look like daggers. They looked like help. An inquest taught towns to move the bottle one shelf higher and the neighbor one chair closer. Tapering diaries are acts of domestic heroism. Reduced one drop. Walked after supper. Slept 2 hours without assistance. Every line is a stitch, pulling a person back into their own skin. The bravado of never again rarely appears. Instead you meet realism that knows storms return. In these pages, domestic addiction becomes a navigable sea. When the urge grows Georgie notebooks, yes, some kept them. Surprised me with their pragmatism. Advised Mrs. J to ask neighbor to sit with the child 2 nights per week. Send her home with lavender and instructions to eat. Not a sermon to be found, only logistics. Hidden Victorian ailments. Grief in a nursery, panic on a bridge, a widow's unquiet nights were met with casseroles, calendars, and quiet absolutions. Occasionally a bottle noted, but as a tool behind a lock, not a first resort. Publishers' archives catch the other end of the thread. Authors bargaining with insomnia, printers begging for copy, editors writing, take rest in margins that mean take drops if you must. Literary greatness was often typeset over a tremor. Some writers mastered routines that starved the habit. Others did not. Either way, the pages remember the price ink demanded when gaslight stretched days into suspicious lengths. Household account books tell on us without a single adjective. All bread, candles, cordial. The line item creeps, shrinks, creeps again with winter. Genteel dependence is visible here as decimals, not size. Sometimes a new entry appears, donated to Mother's Society, paid nurse for sitting, and the cordial line retreats. Money measures morality without speeches. It simply shows what we chose to afford. Occasionally you find a pressed flower tucked beside a hard week, a token from a seaside walk where the tapering held, a child's drawing of a kettle on days when tea outran tincture, a lace scrap from the Sunday a woman returned to choir. These are footnotes the official texts miss. How hope insists on props. Recovery, like relapse, collects souvenirs. The best souvenirs smell of salt, not camphor. Then there are the apologies written to children many years later. I missed hours I can't repay. I cooked with my hands and not my head. I am learning mornings now. These pages are not sub-stories. They're receipts for growth. They show laudanum culture losing its invisibility as people learned to call it by name and to build routines that were stronger than convenience. Families forgave, not by forgetting, but by replacing habit with habit. Walks instead of drafts, neighbors instead of secrets. Hold the bundle, diary leaves, casebook entries, letters that shook. What you hear more than anything is the leitmotif we keep meeting. Only until I'm myself again. In the margins, that promise finally lands new verbs, walk, which sets up our next chapter perfectly. The gendered plot lines behind these papers, how pain, propriety, and the marketplace targeted women most of all, turning caretakers into patients, and angel of the house into a ghost in broad daylight, ready to step into the parlor and the nursery to watch marketing, medicine, and manners braid themselves around Victorian women's. Begin in the parlor where everything looks obedient. Antimacassars squared, hyacinths showing off, the piano pretending not to eavesdrop. Watch the hostess perform 3 jobs at once, referee, nurse, calendar, while her smile holds like good china. The world calls it grace. Her back calls it Tuesday. In a culture that graded women on composure, the quiet promise inside a chemist's bottle felt like a permission slip to keep the facade intact. This is how laudanum culture first tied itself to silk ribbons. Pain was gendered long before anyone printed a label. Nerves, female weakness, hysteria. Polite umbrellas that sheltered everything from endometriosis to postpartum depression to the terror that arrives for no reason and won't leave by logic. Hidden Victorian ailments lived in rooms that smelled of lavender and swallowed clocks. Doctors had limited tools, neighbors had endless opinions. Under that scrutiny, parlor remedies offered privacy that felt like mercy, a teaspoon that didn't gossip. Advertising understood the script and rewrote it in cursive. For delicate constitutions, for the monthly trial, for mother's rest. Phrases designed to sound like empathy while herding women toward purchasable solutions. Not wicked, just efficient. A Victorian opium habit almost never announced itself. It arrived as a housekeeping hack, the next gadget on the mantle. Only this one edited feelings instead of dust. Motherhood made the bottle a multi-tool. Colic nights, teething campaigns, fevers that made the house hold its breath. If the baby sleeps, the neighborhood blesses you. And if the mother sleeps, no one asks. They only admire the results. That is the economy of genteel dependence. Praise the outcome. Ignore the invoice. Only until I'm myself again, she says, meaning only until the laundry stops multiplying and the worry shrinks to something a hem can hold. Class shaped the costume, but not the chemistry. In drawing rooms, relief came in cut glass with Latin on the label. Either way, women learned to manage households with one hand and pain with the other. Account books tell the truth. Coal, bread, candles, cordial. When winter lengthened, the cordial line crept like ivy. That creep wasn't indulgence. It was arithmetic under pressure. The marriage plot assisted. Wives were meant to soothe, not startle. To be reliable scenery for a husband's storms and a children's noise. When a woman became human, tired, sharp, sorrow-lit, the bottle offered to iron the edges. It didn't fix grief. It muted the broadcast. Families applauded the return of calm without asking what it cost. That's domestic addiction in its Sunday dress. Silence mistaken for healing. Compliance mistaken for peace. Doctors, to their credit, started learning new questions. The better ones asked about sleep and sorrow before writing Nervine, prescribed walks in fresh air, and a neighbor's help with the cradle before drops. Yet the clinic closes at 5. The nursery never does. Night favors expedients, and patent medicines sat closer to the pillow than any physician. Even conscientious chemists, with their raised eyebrows and diluted formulas, couldn't outschedule a colic twilight. Widowhood sharpened every edge. Now the woman was bookkeeper, disciplinarian, weather forecaster, and saint on demand. The bottle, already a familiar colleague, auditioned for partner. One more teaspoon to negotiate the bank manager. Another to sing at the funeral without cracking. Respectability loved the performance. But grief compounds interest, and so does dosage. Diaries from these houses read like ledger entries from a siege. We should talk about pleasure too, because pretending it didn't exist keeps lies alive. Some women liked the hush, the float, the way colors gain manners at dusk. They weren't monsters. They were bodies learning which doors opened and which slammed. Laudanum culture sold consistency. Press cork, receive calm. The tragedy isn't that relief felt good. It's that relief replaced support. Resistance had its heroines, often wearing aprons. Mothers' clubs swapped recipes for oat gruel and bath schedules. Temperance women learned the science of sleep, and taught it without scolding. And sisters mailed one another lavender sachets, with instructions and jokes. Parish rooms invented rhoda nights so no single mother had to be a midnight nation. Every hour donated to a neighbor was an hour stolen from the bottle. Mutual aid looked small on paper. It sounded enormous in the cradle. When women did quit, they often did it like they did everything else. Quietly, methodically, with lists. Reduced 2 drops, walked off to tea, asked Mrs. Downs to mind the boys on Thursdays. Tapering diaries become love letters to mornings, proof that arithmetic, not thunder, saves lives. You'll find pressed flowers between those pages, artifacts from the seaside, tokens from days when tea triumphed. The self that returns is not the pre-bottle angel. She's stronger, funnier, and less interested in pretending. Hold this portrait. An empire of care balanced on female nerves, retailers humming lullabies in serif fonts, chemists trying to live with their ledgers, and homes that judged women by silence. Once you see that machinery, the next question is inevitable. What about men, clerks, sailors, preachers, printers, whose pains were renamed duty and dosed just as quietly? In the next chapter we'll pivot to masculine stoicism, clubrooms, and the office clock. How the market taught men to self-medicate in daylight and call it industry, while the same arithmetic clicked beneath the waistcoat. Begin at the counting house, where ledgers smell of dust and ink, where the clock clicks like a supervisor with opinions. Dark shoulders square themselves by habit. His jaw rehearses patience, his eyes translate columns until numbers hum. In that discipline, a thimble of relief lives behind the pen tray, respectable as a paperweight, anonymous as a comma. He calls it prudence, not a Victorian opium habit, because the dose is tiny, the day long, and the office prefers a man who never falters. The hush it buys sounds like competence. Now step into the press room, hot metal, oil, and the thrum that teaches ribs a second heartbeat. Printers work in a weather of noise and deadline. Type bites the fingertips. Proofs bloom red where errors tried to hide. Here, stoicism wears an apron. A cordial at dusk keeps hands from shaking at midnight. A nip at dawn convinces focus to report for duty. Nobody's chasing bliss. They're chasing legibility. That, too, is laudanum culture. Relief repurposed as workmanship and paid for in tiny installments. Clubland tells the same story in better carpet. Polished wood, newspapers folded at the crease. A waiter who knows your cough. A gentleman's nervine arrives in cut glass with Latin on the label or disguised as restorative wine. Genteel dependence fits comfortably under a waistcoat. The bottle speaks the dialect of discretion. Men who mock parlour remedies at home develop their own, tonics dressed as taste. Sailors and stokers chase steadiness with different props. In the Faisali, the sea has an argument with everyone's stomach, and watches carve sleep into pebbles. A pocket vial or a shared pipe becomes a metronome when the horizon won't hold still. Shore leave provides louder options. Shipboard life prefers quiet ones. No one thinks of patent medicines as products out here. They're tools thrown into the same kit as tarred twine and a lucky coin. The goal is simple. Make the next bell bearable. Preachers, teachers, and barristers live by the voice and sell attention for a living. A drop for the throat calms more than throat. A Saturday night draught promises Sunday courage. A council's composing powder shortens the path to sleep when minds refuse dim out. If you want to see hidden Victorian ailments in ties and gowns, watch the moments between duties, where silence is needed on command and earned slowly. Chemistry becomes a servant with exquisite timing. Factories and rail yards teach a harsher math. A labourer who loses a day may lose the week. A porter who shakes drops, orders, and coin. A foreman would rather command men who go on than men who go home. In that economy, domestic addiction disguises itself as reliability. A dram that prevents a scene buys approval from supervisors and shame from nobody, because nobody is supposed to need anything. Only until I'm myself again, goes the chorus, this time sung in bass. At home, the choreography continues. A husband returns worn thin, eats standing, kisses lightly, and reaches for the bedside drawer where a chemist's bottle dozes beside cufflinks. He wouldn't call it a crutch. He'd call it a hinge, the small hardware that lets a heavy door swing without complaint. Wives praised for calm often collude because tomorrow's rent likes steady hands. Secrets don't always live in scandal. Sometimes they live in kindness that cuts corners. Withdrawal, when it finally arrives, doesn't ask permission. The office lights glare. The club feels overwarm. The sermon's syllables turn to gravel. He tries blunt virtue, fails, and settles on tapering the way he balances books. A column of days, a truth told only to the mirror, walks at it like modest investments. A chemist who has seen this before waters formulas and raises that famous eyebrow. Laudanum culture yields to regimen the way storm yields to tide. Slowly and with opinions. Masculine pride complicates rescue. Men built to carry without comment distrust. Help that arrives in sentences. The cures that work tend to look like work, seaside miles logged like tasks, cold water braved like duty, porridge eaten like penance, then repeated like discipline. When a man can file recovery under program rather than confession, he stays. A smart charity knows this and arranges its miracles to resemble schedules, not sermons. The market knows him too. Adds pivot from nervine to appetite tonic, from soporific to pick-me-up, selling pendulums as productivity. A day becomes a seesaw, stimulant for industry, sedative for civility, equilibrium, purchased in installments. He tells himself he's left the bottle. The bottle has merely changed suits. Patent medicines excel at wardrobe. Account books out men more honestly than diaries. All beer, tobacco, restorative. In fat months, the line hides. In lean ones, it grows teeth. When the sun bites, some men sell heirlooms. The decent miracle is the neighbor who offers a shift or a bed. The ledge starts to recover when someone else shares the arithmetic. Keep this frame in mind. The same stoicism that built bridges and balanced ledgers also hid pain well enough to advertise products to it. Masculine virtue made for excellent copy and exquisite customers. The fix wasn't to abolish virtue. It was to widen it and ask, rest and receive, to endure. Which points us straight at our next chapter. The law and the spotlight. Temperance platforms and tabloid thunder, where private habits went public and policy tried, awkwardly, to ouch-out midnight, ready to hear what happened when the docket met the dropper. Start in a coroner's room that smells of ink, damp wool, and boiled tea. The table is plain, the questions aren't. A juror thumbs a chipped pencil while the clerk reads a timeline so tidy it hurts. A teaspoon to compose. A silence that arrived like a thief. No one curses the chemist bottle. They curse uncertainty. The verdict leans toward misadventure, but the room leaves with a new superstition. Move the cordial up a shelf and the cradle closer to the neighbor who can stay awake. Magistrates, court stage, a noisier version. A porter fined for neglect, a shop girl accused of pilfering small change, a landlord complaining about arrears and late-night scenes. The bench learns to spot the glint of parlor remedies in the background, tiny debts to sleep that grew teeth. Some magistrates scold. The wiser ones redirect. A warning to the chemist, a note to the parish visitor, a sentence that sounds like logistics. Report on Tuesdays. Eat at the mission first. Law pretending to be calendar is the best kind of law. Inquest taught newspapers a profitable rhythm. Sadness, explanation, reform. Headlines acquired a new moral fragrance. Soothing, syrup, tragedy. Editors discovered that laudanum culture sold just as well when criticized. so long as the critique came with a vivid paragraph about gaslight stairs and the ordinary bravery of the dead. Outrage kept one eye on column inches, and column inches kept one eye on outrage. Temperance platforms answered with brass bands and crisp sashes. Speeches were half thundercloud, half spreadsheet. How many funerals, how many pennies, how many children walking on tiptoe because fathers' nerves were rented to patent medicines or their liquid cousins. The best speakers didn't only denounce, they distributed tactics. Hot water at night, porridge before work, reading rooms where you could fail to be heroic without being alone. They understood the villain wasn't appetite, it was isolation with good labels. Meanwhile, lawmakers tried to steer a wagon rolling downhill without breaking the wheels. Licenses appeared, poisons lists lengthened, labels learned to say more and whisper less. Enforcement was uneven, because life is uneven. A careful shop in one ward, a careless 3 streets away, yet the culture felt the nudge. Genteel dependence hates ledgers that remember it. Regulation made ledgers that did. Medical societies, newly proud and a little theatrical, debated dosage like poets argue meter. Some called for stricter counters, others urged trust in clinical judgment. Quietly, many doctors rebranded authority as neighborliness. Home visits at dusk, a stern look for the third refill, a prescription for walks and broth that came with a note to the vicar's wife. You can mock it as soft law, but soft law moves kitchens faster than statutes do. When hidden Victorian ailments live in those kitchens, pharmacists found themselves cast as minor magistrates. A raised eyebrow became due process, a diluted mixture, harm reduction, a discreet word with a husband or sister, community policing without the truncheon. The shop that once just sold now triaged, valerian instead of laudanum, a smaller spoon instead of a sermon, fresh air disguised as errands. Commerce, chastened, learned to sell exits as well as entrances. Charities and missions invented workarounds the law couldn't legislate. A shower so a mother could nap without the dropper. Soup kitchens where food stood between a labourer and a shortcut. Sewing rooms that paid in coin and quiet companionship. These were unglamorous miracles. When they were present, domestic addiction lost oxygen. When they vanished, the bottle resumed its soft jurisdiction. Tabloids kept hunting exotic villains. Dens, foreign pipes, silk screens, because pictures sell. Reformers kept pointing back to mantles and bed tables because truth saves. The same alkaloid wore 2 costumes and met 2 fates, raided in alleys, pitied in drawing rooms. It's not that prejudice wrote the laws. It's that prejudice directed the spotlight. The alley went dark under inspection. The parlor learned to label its lamps. In court, the phrases hardened. Withdrawal. Tolerance, overdoser. Language built railings for families to grip. The quiet revolution was grammatical. People could finally say what was happening without apologizing to etiquette. Once a mother can say, "I'm tapering," instead of "my nerves." The house rearranges itself around a plan, not a fog. Words didn't cure, but they scheduled cure. Of course, there were overreaches. Zeal that confused medicine with malice. Crusades that swapped compassion for headlines. But the longer story is mundane, and therefore impressive. Fewer anonymous bottles. Fewer midnight purchases. More daylight help. Fewer secrets. More schedules. The culture didn't quit pain. It learned to keep receipts. Victorian opium habit didn't disappear so much as lose its invisibility cloak. Hold that image. Docket sheets with tender margins, platforms that traded fireworks for instructions, labels that finally told the truth, to eyes that were ready to read it. Which leads us to the rooms that remembered everything. The libraries and drawing rooms of the literati, where writers, painters, and composers negotiated muse versus medicine, and turned their bargains into art and cautionary tales. Ready to step into salons and garrets, where relief became metaphor, and the metaphor sometimes refused to end on the page. Picture a garret under slate, rain combing the roof, lamp oil breathing its thin halo while paper waits like snow. A poet tests a first line, back twinging, nerves like sparrows. On the desk, pen, pencil, stale biscuit, and the small amber chemist bottle that behaves like punctuation. Not sin, not spectacle, just a promise that words will stop hiding. In this room, a Victorian opium habit doesn't look like a vice. It looks like a deadline strategy with a cork. Salons tell a glossier version. Plush curtains, a grand piano, voices braided with laughter and debate. Someone reads a sonnet. Someone quotes a letter from Italy. Someone coughs and accepts a discreet draught in cut glass. Respectable rooms prefer respectable solutions, so parlour remedies circulate with the tea, tonics for nerves, cordials for the throat, powders for... No one announces genteel dependence. They simply applaud stamina and pretend not to notice the glass, doing half the speaking. Here's the quiet physics of creativity. Attention as weather. Good weather is rare and rented by the minute. Laudanum culture sold umbrellas, tiny rented calms, so a composer could catch a motif before it bolted. A painter could steady a hand when dawn arrived too fast. A novelist could unspool dialogue without tripping over dread. The umbrella worked until it didn't. Then the habit rewrote the stanza breaks and took a cut of every paragraph. Editors became pharmacists by accident. A manuscript late. Rest, then finish. Rest arrived in brown paper, advertised between serial installments. Many medicines love periodical culture. Periodical culture loved punctual authors. Author and bottle shook hands over the schedule. Nobody designed the loop. The loop designed itself. The ledger called it revenue. The diary called it the usual relief. Merits breed bargains. Only until I'm myself again, the leitmotif whispers, now wearing an ink-stained shirt. 1 teaspoon to draft, 1 to revise, 1 to sleep, after that wicked bright hour when your own prose refuses to stop talking. The first drafts are better, the fourth are not. The seventh are late. A bottle that began as a ladder turns into a metronome, then into a boss. That's domestic addiction with literary manners. Never shouting, always scheduling. Critics didn't miss the scent. Reviews started to recognize cadences that felt a little perfumed. Chapters that glowed hot, and then cooled oddly. Some artists owned the cost in their letters. Health poor. Perseverance assisted. Others built genius myths to hide invoices. Sacred suffering, peculiar nerves, the tragic necessity of tincture. Myth pays rent until it doesn't. Not every garret leaned on glass. Some built life belts out of daylight. Morning walks with a notebook, cold water at the basin, strict pages before porters, friends who confiscated keys after midnight. Few editors turned pastoral. Deadlines paired with soup. Proofs exchanged for a promise to sleep unassisted twice a week. Small, unfashionable tactics outperform drama. They always do. But drama sells better than oatmeal, and the Century kept buying headlines that the quiet rooms had already solved with porridge and bedtimes. Paying room, real and unpoetic, also lived upstairs. Spines wrecked by posture, tooth rot shredding focus, grief that made the page swim. These were the hidden Victorian ailments behind many celebrated voices. Laudanum didn't give talent. It rented silence while talent worked. That's why contempt misses the mark. If your back screamed at every clause, you'd be tempted by any hush with a cork. Compassion doesn't excuse the invoice. It explains why the invoice kept getting paid. Coteries created echo chambers. A poet admired by friends who drank the same cordial hears praised that idiots caution out of the air. A painter's dealer prefers punctual canvases to honest sleep. A biographer tidies margins to preserve a legend's jawline. The social scaffolding around laudanum culture mattered as much as chemistry. If the room rewards output and forgives the method grows ivy on the mantle. Withdrawal, when attempted, looks like a blank page that won't blink. The hand shakes at the wrong times. Metaphors arrive with mud on their boots. The critic in your head gets louder than the paragraph in front of you. Successful retreats read like training logs. Fewer drops, more walks. A return to short sentences. Friends who bring stew and confiscate despair for 3 hours at a time. Recovery has its own literary style. muscular, modest, less interested in fireworks, more interested in finishing with both daylight and dignity intact. Art made souvenirs out of all this. Paintings with rooms too, still to be real. Novels with characters who compose themselves and pay an unnamed price. Memoirs that confess in a whisper and then teach in an aside. The best works became instruction manuals disguised as beauty, showing readers how to keep mornings sacred even when nights argued. Art, in other words, became medicine that didn't require a spoon. Hold this scene lightly. Genius courting a bottle, a market profiting from both, a few stubborn friends conspiring to replace corks with calendars. The story doesn't end with a single artist or reform. It ends with chemistry itself pulling up a chair. Isolated alkaloids, hypodermic needles, laboratory precision, about to change the way relief entered the body, and, with it, the shape of dependence. Ready to step into the bright clinical rooms where the dropper meets the syringe and the 20th century learns a faster, sharper alphabet for the same old bargain. Walk into a late Victorian laboratory and the room feels like a polite thunderstorm. Hissing jets, blue flame, glass throats catching light, labels in tidy Latin. On one bench sits the familiar chemist's bottle. On another, small vials that look like bottled intent. Here, opium stops being a friendly rust-brown soup and becomes fractions you can weigh, isolate, and repeat. Precision arrives wearing spectacles. For families raised on parlor remedies, this is both comfort and omen. Relief no longer smells like cloves and orange peel. It ticks like a metronome. Laudanum culture doesn't die. It graduates into sharper tools. Meet the star pupil. Morphine, crystalline, measurable, obedient to balances that don't lie. Doctors adore it because it acts like a promise. This many grains yield that many minutes of quiet. In a world that mistrusts guesswork, a drug that behaves is practically a colleague. The old Victorian opium habit knew drift and variation. The new regimen knows dosage charts and case notes. Dependence, once wrapped in ritual, learns arithmetic. Quiet gets faster, the bill gets steeper. Then someone fits a hollow needle to a calibrated barrel, and the skin becomes a door with a key. A pinch, a push, a breath, and pain folds its tent before you've finished the sentence. The shock is not just the relief, it's the speed. The body, newly impressed, files a memory labeled, "Do that again." The dropper used to negotiate, the syringe commands. Old habits wore slippers. This one wears boots and keeps better time. Bedside theatre changes overnight. The medicine spoon yields to polished steel housed in velvet cases, a talisman of modernity that patients both fear and request. Nurses boil water. Physicians tap bubbles from glass like tiny omens. Respectability wraps the jab in white linen and Latin. Yet the circuitry underneath is familiar. Ache, answer, amen. Genteel dependence doesn't vanish. It moves into wards and consulting rooms where choices are narrated in professional voices. War accelerates everything. On battered fields and in hospital tents, morphine is mercy with a plunger. It silences shrapnel and stitches, steadies phantom limbs, and lets surgeons outrun screams long enough to sew. When peace limps home, so do men whose nights remember the needle more vividly than their medals. What began as battlefield triage becomes domestic addiction, conducted from an armchair. The same bargain, only now the body expects lightning, not lanterns. Doctors notice a new weather pattern. Cravings with shorter intervals, withdrawals that speak in pins, shivers, and clocks that tick too loud. The diaries change tone. Less pewter romance, more laboratory prose. 2 syringes pledged to destroy. Impulse returned at 4. Because the route is swifter, the cycle is tighter. Families who once managed with teaspoons and tea learn a sterner choreography. Watch the hours, hide the kit. Count victories in afternoons, not seasons. Pharmacies adapt with lock and key theatrics. Ampules arrive in foam-lined boxes. Poisons registers get extra columns. The counter clerk's raised eyebrow graduates into paperwork that knows your handwriting. Patent medicines pivot to non-opiate, scientific, modern, even as some quietly fold other excitants into their recipes to keep customers orbiting the counter. Respectability keeps inventing new costumes. Chemistry keeps seeing through them. Stigma rebrands as well. A sip in a parlor reads as caretaking. A jab in a back room reads as scandal. Class writes captions under identical chemistry. Gentlewomen compose, dockers shoot up, churches preach, newspapers gawk, and the quiet truth sits between them. The root changed faster than the reasons. Hidden Victorian ailments, unnameable grief, sleepless dread, the pain that gets called nerves, because nobody has better words, find their way to the same relief by a shorter road. Art and advertising catch the pose. Engravings show syringes like silver serpents. Pamphlets promise painless dentistry and scientific rest. Critics mutter about prose that tastes of ether. Meanwhile, the home kit acquires its own etiquette. Boil, cool, swab, conceal. Where laudanum culture once trained hands to measure drops, the new ritual trains hands to chase bubbles out of barrels and shame out of mirrors. Treatment learns to translate speed back into slowness. Some physicians reverse the route, switching injections to measured oral doses, then to bitter tonics, then to walks and soup, like downshifting before a hill. Cure cottages rewrite schedules, fewer plungers, more porch hours, nights tallied in chapters read, rather than syringes used. The arithmetic is stubborn but survivable. Less today, a little more patience tomorrow, and a community that counts with you. Technology, ironically, makes secrecy easier. Leather cases the size of a prayer book slip into pockets. Alcohol lamps fold like spectacles. Instructions print small enough to live behind a mirror. Mobility turns relief into a traveling companion, which means it can follow you to meetings, carriages, and anniversaries. The old bottle needed a room. The new kit needs only a minute. That portability is genius for pain and gasoline for habit. Keep your ear tuned to our leitmotif. Only until I'm myself again. With needles, the phrase acquires a metronome. Myself arrives fast and leaves faster. The interval becomes the prison. Which is why the next turn in our story felt, at first, like a miracle with good branding. A heroic new derivative, marketed as safer, cleaner, ideal for coughs and nerves, sold in amber innocence to households who wanted lightning without the storm. Ready to open the polished box with the most ironic name of the age, and to watch how a label nearly outran the truth. Open the drawer of a late-century medicine cabinet and admire the choreography of modernity. Velvet-lined case, crisp label, logo that smiles like a guarantee. Inside, a vial tilts like a promise, scientific, civilized, utterly sure of itself. The name on the label sounds brave, even moral, as if courage could be decanted. This isn't the old amber chemist bottle with clove breath. It's laboratory light in pocket form, sold as cleaner than soup. Respectability loves new fonts, and laudanum culture knows how to change its clothes. Chemistry had shaped opium into syllables and crowned one, diacetylmorphin, with a nickname that practically stood to attention. Doctors liked its manners. Quick onset, tidy dose, remarkable hush where coughs had camped for weeks. Advertisers liked the plot twist. Relief without yesterday's baggage, a hero to replace the scandal-tired bottle. A Victorian opium habit could pretend to retire while merely updating its stationery. Progress, the label implied, had finally solved virtue's time management. Pharmacy staged the upgrade like theatre. Ampules nested in cotton, syrups in beveled glass, lozenges wrapped like sweets you'd trust a child to carry. For night coughs, for nerves, for morphine dependence. The genius of the pitch was circular. Here is a cure for the cure you took last month. Patent medicines learn to speak laboratory with a parish accent. The counter clerk, part usher, part priest, presented science as absolution you could swallow. In parlors, the rebrand felt like emancipation. No more sticky tincture. No more suspicious spoon. A measured draught, a civilized tablet, a bedtime without bargaining. Genteel dependents always asked for three things: speed, silence, and style. And here they were, boxed. You poured a small golden promise into a glass, told yourself it wasn't the old thing, and slept under the flag of a new word. Tonics applauded for different reasons. In pneumonia wards and consumptive homes, the heroic bottle throttled coughs that had shredded families all winter. Physicians wrote case notes that read like hymns to oxygen. The tool worked, and working tools become habits faster than sermons can keep up. In ledger marked relief, countless tick marks in the footnotes, a quiet question about tomorrows that need larger ticks. Speed rewrote the calendar. Dot. Where laudanum was a lantern, this was lightning. The body, ever a quick learner, filed the lesson under urgent. This is how fast calm can arrive. Soon midnight wanted 9 o'clock's hush. Afternoons wanted morning's mercy. The interval shrank. Domestic addiction stopped wearing slippers and learned to sprint. The dropper's polite negotiation yielded to appointments carved by a clock with sharper teeth. Households shifted their choreography to match. Bedside trays added ampules and tiny lamps. Travel kits learned a new compartment. The parlor remedies shelf grew a row of labels with heroic vows. Mothers who had sworn off the old cordial for the baby's sake found themselves praising a syrup for troublesome coughs because the advertisement whispered that science had washed the sin out. The room looked cleaner. The chemistry was simply faster. Class drew new curtains over the same stage. Gentle families praised modern treatment. Dockside patients took the identical hush from plainer bottles and kept fewer receipts. Respectability always edits captions. The same dose reads as prudence in a drawing room and scandal in a back court. The material truth, breath slowed, pain folded, didn't change. Social truth, who got pity, who got police, did. Diaries adjusted their grammar. Fewer florid confessions, more clockwork. 2 files lasted 3 nights. No cough, better appetite, sleepless by 4, repeated dose. The math grew tight, the handwriting small. A few chemists, alarmed, watered formulas or steered loyal customers toward bitter substitutes. Others counted sales and reminded themselves that miracles always have waiting lists. Hidden Victorian ailments, grief, panic, throats that bled from winter, remained eloquent clients. Critics, temperance women, and a scattering of skeptical physicians began poking the heroic myth with numbers. Cases of cure followed by quieter chains, coughs that returned wearing new crowns, patients who could not find morning without finding the vial first. The debate moved from adjectives to intervals. How long between doses, how sharp the return, how quickly help became need. Labels learned to mutter warnings. Advertisements learned smaller fonts. The public learned, painfully, to read both. Withdrawal under the new regime sounded like a metronome dropped down a stairwell. The remedies that worked best were stubbornly old. Broth, baths, walks, witnesses, time. Clinics began reversing the chemical ladder. Needle back to spoon, spoon back to tonics, tonics back to calendars, teaching bodies to accept lantern pace after months of lightning. It wasn't romantic. It was arithmetic, and it saved futures that preferred boredom to brilliance. Hold the polished vial up to the window, and you'll see the whole age reflected. Faith in science, terror of scandal, exhaustion-hunting shortcuts, markets that can smell both. The heroic label wasn't a lie so much as a wish, and wishes, as any century learns, hire bookkeepers. Next, we open the family album. Children dosed to silence, coughs muted into sleep, little graves that taught towns to lift bottles higher and neighbors closer. Ready for topic 15, where safety became a sales word and the nursery learned to answer back. Open the nursery door at dusk and you'll smell everything at once. Milk warmed to kindness, starch in little frocks, coal muttering in the grate, lavender tucked into linen like a promise. On the washstand sits the tray, spoon, napkin, cup, and beside it a small amber chemist's bottle that has been a nurse's colleague for a decade. Teething screams, colic storms, fevers that glow like lanterns under a baby's skin. Victorian knights asked for miracles, and miracles arrived with corks. Silence, once bought, became proof of competence. Modern and culture loved rooms where quiet was graded higher than sleep honestly earned. But the cradle keeps receipts. Infants are terrible at pretending, and their bodies started telling the truth that labels softened. The fabled soothing syrups did soothe. They also slowed tiny breaths into arithmetic nobody wanted to count. Inquests, spare and devastating, stacked like thin snow. 1 teaspoon too generous, one mother too exhausted, one night. Kitchens began to whisper a new superstition. Lift the bottle higher, lift the neighbour closer. The habit of dosing the home into obedience, domestic addiction in miniature, felt less like prudence and more like playing cards with midnight. Mothers weren't villains. They were engineers working with bad data. The day asked for hymn singing mercy and spotless parlours. The night asked for stamina no mortal owns. A measured draught looked like stewardship. Keep the household asleep, keep the marriage civil, keep tomorrow employable. Parlour remedies had built a reputation as tools polite people could trust. The chemistry didn't change. The perspective did. Once towns read the inquest columns over breakfast, the bottle's blush darkened. Respectability developed second thoughts. Nurses and midwives adjusted first because they heard the breathing. They began to swap recipes like talismans. Oat jelly thickened to sincerity. Fennel tea, poppy head pillows retired to folklore. Rocking techniques travelled like hymns. Winding became an art. Swaddling loosened from mummy stiff to human. In notebooks written between feeds, you see a new grammar. Walked, bathed, sang, waited. Verbs that paid out slower than a dropper, yet never presented a bill at the coroner's table. The Victorian opium habit met its gentlest resistance in aprons and lullabies. Mists, to their credit, learned to flinch. The decent shops watered formulas, moved infant bottles behind the counter, and coached mothers with an eyebrow that had graduated from suggestion to policy. Labels, prodded by law and sorrow, shed lullaby fonts for sterner type. Patent medicines that once bragged of perfect composure discovered the new sales word, safety, and tried to rent it. Some meant it. Others learned to sound like they did. Clergy and charities built routines that looked like miracles because they were scheduled. Mothers' meetings turned into logistics swaps. Who can sit up on Thursdays, which aunt can take the 2 a.m. patrol, whose kettle never runs dry. Creches opened their doors for nap hours. Parish rooms staged quiet corners with clean cots and watchful eyes. Nobody called it harm reduction. They called it kindness. But every hour borrowed rest was an hour the bottle didn't get to audition. Fathers entered the script by invitation, and sometimes by embarrassment. Printed tracts suggested a new form of masculinity. Carry the baby, learn the walk, take the dawn shift before the yard whistle. Strong stopped meaning stoic, and started meaning useful. The best homes learned that a man can rock a cradle without surrendering dignity. When dads joined the choreography, the genteel dependence that had crept into nurseries lost half its alibi. Doctors, now with statistics in their coat pockets, retooled advice. Less nervine, more nap. Less tincture, more sun. Less female weakness, more honest naming of pain that had always been work by another name. Pediatric lectures began to sound like cookbooks and marching orders. Warm baths, small feeds, darker rooms, shorter sermons. They didn't ban the chemist's bottle outright. They were realists, but they demoted it under a stack of simpler tools that didn't need a label to be legal. Manufacturers tried to keep the market by changing clothes faster than contrition. Opium-free banners, purely botanical blends, syrups with sugar and soporifics that had different surnames. Mothers learned to read ingredient lists like they read the weather. Some brands earned trust by telling the truth and tolerating smaller sales. Others drifted into the grey, where regulation blinked. The nursery, newly literate, became its own censor. Diaries from these years are fierce and practical. No syrup tonight. Walked until 2. Mrs. Cook sat with me, bless her, teeth through. Slept on chest, no draught since Monday. These are not sentimental pages, they are engineering logs for human nights. The leitmotif of laudanum culture, only until I'm myself again, reappears with a twist. Only until we can sleep without help. Solidarity is the new sedative. Not every house converted. Poverty measures patience in inches. One room, 5 souls, and a shift bell at 5 can make ethics sound like a luxury. Here, real reform looked like rent lowered, wages paid on time, milk clean, and a neighbor's door that opened even when pride begged it to stay shut. Wherever the city invested in predictability, bottles lost altitude. Wherever it invested in lectures without soup, nothing changed but the adjectives. By the century's turn, the nursery had found its voice. Labels still crowded the newspapers, but the house answered back with routines, networks, and a sharpened eye. Babies slept because bodies learned to, not because chemistry imposed truce. And that change taught the wider home something bolder. If the smallest humans could be protected by structure, maybe grown-ups could too. Which carries us into the dining room and the bedroom, where family truce-making, routines, boundaries, and that strange new device called good sleep hygiene. Ready for topic 16, where the grown-ups reorganize their evenings so mornings stop needing rescue. Start at twilight, the hour when worries come home wearing boots. You dim the lamps, close the sash, and decide that evening won't audition for disaster. In the wake of nursery reforms, adults stole the same playbook. Smaller plates, slower talk, a kettle that sings before the cork does. The old chemist's bottle is still in the house. History rarely leaves by the front door, but it sits high, behind polite clutter, where reaching it requires a ladder and an explanation. Structure, not heroics, becomes the way you tell your nerves what time it is. Supper is repurposed as medicine you don't have to confess. Broth first, then bread. Sweet saved for laughter, not for bribes. Alcohol behaves as a guest, not a landlord. You learn the trick the best kitchens knew. If the table's warm and the washing up predictable, rooms stop whispering about shortcuts. Laudanum culture thrived on empty stomachs and late oaths. Full bowls and early dishes cut its supply lines without a speech. Light is the second ingredient. Gas mantles turned down early, curtains pulled to erase street drama, a single reading lamp that teaches the room to exhale. You'd be amazed what gentler photons do to pulse and pride. Where glare made patience brittle, pools of light make it bend. This is sleep hygiene. In a century that didn't use the phrase, darkness on purpose, not as an accident. Genteel dependent struggles when the stage stops asking for solos. Conversation gets a curfew, not a muzzle. Hard topics are given a lane after dishes, before prayers, and then dismissed to tomorrow like guests who've outstayed tea. 2 chairs near the fire become a truce table where criticism takes off its boots at the door. You learn to swap "what's wrong with you" for "what do you need for morning?" That sentence has the odd power to bankrupt midnight. Domestic addiction quietly withers when the house edits its script. Movement replaces moping. A 10-minute constitutional after supper, shawls on, hats tolerant, street dogs suspicious but ultimately approving. You walk the same small square so often that lamplighters nod, and the body stops treating bedtime as an ambush. Even aching joints concede to rhythm. Factories taught you to march for wages. Now you march for rest. In diaries that once read like dosage logs, new verbs arrive. Walked, stretched, breathed, and the old chorus, "Only until I'm myself again," starts to sound like a promise the body can keep without bottles. Bedrooms are renovated with patience, not coin. Mattresses rotated, drafts out-argued with rolled towels, basins placed where knees won't curse. Windows open 2 fingers, unless the east wind is spoiling for a fight. Scent becomes instruction. Lavender to tell the lungs they're off duty. Camphor banished to the sick room, so sleep stops confusing itself with illness. Parlor remedies aren't exiled. They're demoted behind rituals that don't require labels. Work learns to respect tomorrow. Ledgers close earlier, Letters dictated rather than written when hands start to scroll apologies, mending stopped at good enough. Employers who once preferred a dosed, tireless clerk learn, by attrition and grief, that a tired mind rents mistakes at interest. The cheapest insurance turns out to be schedules that end. Even patent medicines lose their alibi when the foreman sends people home on time. The mantle rebrands substitutions as culture instead of cure. Tea replaces tincture, and the teapot gains a reputation for miracles it never claimed. Penny press puzzles substitute for late gossip. Psalms share the rota with Dickens and penny dreadfuls, because any story that steals an hour from worry is a friend. You're not being tricked. You're being trained. Hidden Victorian ailments still knock, but they meet a doorman with a rota and a sense of humour. Neighbours become infrastructure. A bell pull to Mrs. Cook for widow days, a note to the vicar's wife when palpitations rehearse their encore, a gentleman's club whose Tuesday rule quietly forbids remedies after 9. Mutual aid loses its cape and puts on an apron. Lent blankets, shared kettles, a spare cot that belongs to everyone and therefore to you. When the street is reliable, the cupboard grows less persuasive. Confession goes practical. Instead of, "my nerves," people start saying, "I'm tapering. I sleep better after a walk. The second cup of tea is a mistake." Words are tiny carpenters. They build habits that survive weather. Even chemists join the grammar lesson, adding "try broth first" to labels and raising the eyebrow that means tomorrow. Not now. The shop, once a silent accomplice to the Victorian opium habit, becomes a quiet coach. Relapse isn't theatrical. It's Tuesday with a leak in it. Choreography for those nights is rehearsed in daylight. Call a friend, boil the kettle. Put the bottle where the conscience has to climb to reach it. Shame is banished because it buys nothing worth having. Arithmetic takes over. Fewer recurrences this month than last. More mornings owned fair and square. Laudanum culture hates being counted by neighbors who also bring soup. By year's end the house knows itself. The lamp is lower, the table saner, the bed smarter, the street friendlier. Nobody throws parades for fewer teaspoons, but the body does, quietly, at 6 a.m. Once you feel that dividend, mornings that don't need rescue, you start asking larger questions about what the city itself could redesign. Wages, housing, leisure, and law. Which nudges us toward topic 17, the Edwardian remix, where municipal reform, national labeling laws, and early social insurance to scale these household tricks into public health. Shall we step into the town hall and read the new rulebook together? Walk into the town hall just before a meeting and listen to the furniture learn purpose. Chairs scrape into rows, tea steams in big brown pots, and clerks unroll charts like sales. What you figured out at home, lamps low, soup first, honest sleep, has been promoted to policy. Reformers talk in the grammar of kitchens. Steadier wages, shorter hours, cleaner milk, and labels that speak English before Latin. The point isn't to scold. It's to scale. If a family routine could starve a habit, perhaps a city routine could starve a whole laudanum culture. You're not the only one who wants the chemist's bottle out of arm's reach. Labels learn new manners. Bottles that once hummed poetry now submit to prose, ingredients spelled out, dosages boxed, warnings that don't whisper. The ledger behind the counter develops a spine. Purchases earn signatures. The cheerful ambiguity of soothing cordials becomes rarer than snow in June. You can feel respectability shifting under your feet. Patent medicines survive if they can tell the truth and still help. The others become cautionary footnotes. You, wiser by diaries and debriefs, read before you pour. Knock on a door with a brass plate that reads "District Nurse" and meet the front line of the remix. She carries a scale, a thermometer, and a sturdy kind of optimism. Babies get weighed instead of muted. Mothers get naps planned instead of nerves named. She brings fennel tea and feeding charts, not just sympathy. In those 10 minutes on a cold stoop, parlour remedies lose their monopoly. Competence arrives in a shawl and leaves a house trimmed with confidence. The old Victorian opium habit doesn't vanish, but it finds fewer cradles willing to rent it a pillow. Schools join the conspiracy of kindness. Free breakfasts, medical inspections, warm water for hands that never met taps at home, small mercies with long shadows. Coughs that would have been dosed into silence meet porridge and fresh air instead. Teachers keep an eye on the pale and the fidgeting. A note home recommends soup, not syrup. You can feel a century inching toward a new arithmetic. Nourish first, dose last. The hidden Victorian elements of hunger and damp finally get named and fed. Workplaces are re-scripted by daylight. Factory bells ring a truce with exhaustion. Hours compress, lunchrooms replace alleyway gulps. Washhouses teach skin and lungs that someone is on their side. A foreman learns that a steady worker is cheaper than a superhuman one who breaks by Michaelmas. In that ledger, domestic addiction loses overtime. Where yesterday demanded a nervine to endure the last, dangerous hour, today ends before the bottle earns the right to speak. Temperance sheds thunder for furniture. Tea rooms bloom like practical sermons. Coffee stalls keep night shifts company. Reading rooms give aching people something to do with their patients. The new evangel is logistics. Porridge recipes, baby rotas, walking clubs. You watch genteel dependence lose its alibi. When a city hands out alternatives that don't shame, the cork squeaks less often for everyone. Piety stops wagging its finger and starts laying tables. Advertising, chastened, learns to pass audits. Claims shrink. Fonts sober up. Testimonials get suspicious when they want show addresses. A few legacy brands reinvent themselves as honest tonics with unromantic virtues. Bitter, boring, useful. Others go quietly out of print. A newspaper that used to sell both remedies and outrage sells fewer of each and more instructions. Even the penny press discovers there's good money in checklists that keep households boring and alive. Insurance and welfare at scaffolding where families kept falling. Thingafits mean you can rest without selling the bed. Convalescent homes make take the sea air more than a fantasy. Clubs offer doctor's notes that beat the dropper for authority. You recognize the psychology at once. It was the old refrain of laudanum culture. The new one is, I can afford to wait. When time is not a luxury item, chemistry stops winning by default. Pharmacies become counseling booths as much as counters. Poisons registers thicken. Bottles migrate behind wood and glass. Broth first appears on lips as often as 2 drams. Some chemists start a fashion for substitutions that respect pride. Valerian before chloral, lavender before anything with teeth. A good shop feels like a small republic. Rules posted, mercy practiced, receipts that read like promises kept. Cities of empire, crowded with sailors, newcomers, and hard luck. Translate reform into many tongues. Bilingual labels keep misunderstandings from turning cruel. Midwives and mutual aid lodges do what government can't, arrive faster than shame. The chemist's bottle still travels, but so do hymn sheets of practical wisdom. How to wind a child. How to share night watches, which clinic doesn't make you feel like a headline. The same hidden Victorian ailments. Loneliness, grief, work that gnaws, meet new acoustics for their names. Statistics and stories finally shake hands. Health officers plot curves that show fewer small graves. Journals note declines in oversoothed infants. Coroners file thinner inquests. Meanwhile, diaries grow dull in the most beautiful way. Less cork, more kettle. Fewer composing drafts, more slept. The house learns to be furniture again instead of theatre. Laudanum culture doesn't disappear. It shrinks from furniture to footnote. But every solution has a sequel. Laboratories keep inventing new alphabets, barbiturates with better bedside manners, sedatives with cleverer labels, injections with brighter promises. Scripts replace shop buys, schedules replace winks. The old bargain, speed, silence. Which is why, before we close the album, we'll fast forward into topic 18. Survived into new bottles, new pills, and our own timelines. And what stubborn human tactics still work when labels change and needs done. Stand in a modern bathroom at midnight, soft lead lemony cleanser, the hum of a fan, and you'll still find a quiet altar. Neat blister packs, amber vials, sleepy time teas with smiling moons. The labels changed, the reflex didn't. When life outpaces patience, we still reach for chemistry that promises to fold the night neatly. That's the long echo of laudanum culture. Not the tincture itself, but the choreography, performed in better lighting. You don't need Victorian wallpaper for the old sentence to return. Only until I'm myself again. Listen to the marketing grammar. Yesterday it purred, soothing, cordial. Today it murmurs, non-habit-forming, fast-acting, clinically gentle. Fonts are calmer, the claims lawyered, but the story remains recognizable. By steadiness by the dose, rent courage in milligrams. We're clever about patent medicines, but the market is clever too. It sells pendulums, downers for night, uppers by day, as if equilibrium were a subscription. Progress is real. So is muscle memory. Consider the cupboard we inherited from the Victorians. Parlour remedies reimagined as wellness, lavender sprays, magnesium baths, chamomile sachets, and the respectable pharmaceuticals that sit beside them. None of this is wicked. Much of it is mercy. The risk hides in the arithmetic, when relief becomes routine faster than routine becomes relief. That's where domestic addiction still learns to whisper in fluent respectability. The doses are smaller, the labels friendlier, the choreography the same. Our mirrors are kinder and crueler at once. We name things better. Panic, postpartum depression. But naming can be prelude to outsourcing. If there's a word for it, surely there's a bottle for it too. The Victorian chemist's bottle has been replaced by an app, a dispenser, a delivery, more discreet, less dramatic, equally persuasive at 2 a.m. Convenience lowers shame. It can also lower the threshold for reaching before asking. What still works looks gloriously unmodern. Schedules, soup, sunlight, shared duty. The Edwardian remix taught cities to scale household wisdom. The 21st can do the same with neighborhoods, group chats, and doorbells that summon help faster than impulse. A friend who messages, "Walk?" at dusk is a high-tech district nurse. A workplace that prefers a day off to a medicated blur is practicing public health without a podium. These aren't quaint. They're engineered buffers against the slide. The gendered plot persists in subtler costumes. Caregivers, often women, still get graded by composure, reach for bottled poise. Men still baptize self-medication as productivity and call fatigue. Different labels, same bargain. The antidote hasn't changed since diaries were calfskin. Redistribute the night. Share the cradle, share the inbox, share the 3 a.m. walk around the block. Genteel dependence starves when competence is communal. Clinicians are our modern chemists with better guardrails. Tracking, taper plans, alternatives that respect pride. The wise ones prescribe time as medicine, exposure to morning light, fatigue earned by movement, rituals that make pillows feel like promises kept. They don't ban bottles, they demote them. And when they do reach for medication, they attach calendar and conversation the way Victorians learned. Dose plus daylight. Advertising still auditions solutions in silk. Wellness sells aesthetics for the same reason laudanum once sold language. Beauty disarms scrutiny. Our defense, as ever, is math. What happens to the interval between doses? Do ordinary evenings require extraordinary aids more often than last month? Dilate quietly. The ledger is not a scold. It's a friend who remembers when you're too tired to. In every century, arithmetic breaks enchantment. Archives gift us the most humane recipe. Boredom by design. Predictable suppers. Lamps lowered early. Short walks that end before excuses begin. Stories that hold you kindly by the sleeve for 20 minutes and then let you sleep. This is not anti-science. It's infrastructure for science to need less heroism. When homes move from theater back to furniture, bottles, old or new, have fewer lines. And yes, relapse still visits without ringing. The choreography that rescues hasn't changed. Witnesses instead of willpower, substitutions instead of self-accusation, the humility to text, "I'm not fine," the courage to answer, "coming." Shame remains the most expensive ingredient in any remedy. Spend none of it. The Victorians taught us that secrecy fattens habits. Air and company thin them. If you want a single leitmotif to keep, steal the nursery's reply. We'll sleep because our day earned it. Let morning become the judge you prepare to please. Build a house that rehearses rest in daylight, meals that forgive the clock, work that ends on purpose, thresholds that tell the body where stage stops and backstage begins. Then, when the dark auditions every shortcut, you'll have a script older than the bottle and wiser than any label. Close the cabinet door. Breathe. You're not living in a museum of vices. You're tending a workshop of small mercies. The Victorians left us more than cautionary tales. They left blueprints for ordinary heroism. Neighbours, schedules, funny little teas, boring dinners, and a stubborn preference for mornings that don't need rescue. Keep those, and even when the world whispers, "Only until I'm myself again." We've walked the whole house. The nursery at 2 a.m., the counting house at noon, the club at dusk, the clinic by the sea, and everywhere the same choreography appeared. Pain, purchase, peace, performed in different costumes. That's the heart of laudanum culture. Not a single villain, but a habit of outsourcing hard nights to easy labels. The little chemist bottle was a mirror more than a monster, reflecting a century that prized quiet over questions and composure over conversation. Across diaries, dockets, and advertisements, one refrain haunted the margins. "Only until I'm myself again." It justified teaspoons in the cradle and elegant drops in the parlour. It sold patent medicines in fonts that purred virtue and hid arithmetic. When relief worked, it felt like grace. When it ruled, it became domestic addiction in polite shoes, what we called genteel dependence when the curtains were clean. Names changed, needs didn't. And the cure, when it came, wasn't thunder. It was boring, brave structure. Listen to the artifacts we collected: the clink of glass, the lavender sachet, the raised eyebrow of a cautious chemist, the district nurse's chart, the seaside schedule that taught nerves to purr without permission slips. Those small mercies beat spectacle every time. They turned hidden Victorian ailments into problems with plans. Soup before syrup, walks before worries, neighbours before secrecy. When cities learned to scale those household tricks. Shorter hours, straighter labels, steadier wages. So let's keep the compassion and lose the romance. Relief is not wicked, it's a tool. Secrecy is the costly thing. Shame fattens habits. Witnesses thin them. What saved people then still saves us now. Calendars that protect sleep, kitchens that feed patience, friendships that answer midnight like a bell. Love stops being a speech and becomes logistics. Who takes the dawn shift? Who opens the window 2 fingers? Who reminds the room that mornings are worth fighting for? This wasn't just a video, it was a map. Where do you see the old bargain in your present? What modern bottle, pill, or glow-in-the-dark shortcut whispers? "Only until I'm myself again"? Which ritual could you replace with a quieter one? TA instead of tincture, a walk instead of a scroll, an honest ask instead of a heroic pretense. Virtue doesn't need louder rules, it needs wider ones. Endure. Yes, but also ask, rest, receive. Tell me in the comments so we can learn from each other. What surprising detail cracked a myth for you? Which tiny ritual will you test tonight to help tomorrow arrive intact? Do you have a family? Parlour remedy story? Comforting or cautionary? Where did you spot the double standard between parlour and alley? If you could rewrite one label, literal or metaphorical, what would it finally say? If this journey gave you a new lens, or even just one sentence that rescues a future evening, share it with someone who needs gentler nights. And to keep exploring the hidden rules behind the pretty pictures, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. That way, the next chapter finds you exactly when you need it, before the house gets loud. Thanks for walking the long road with me. The bottle can go back on the high shelf now. The ledger is simpler. The morning is ours.